The sharp scent of burnt bread hung in the air of the small cabin, a bitter reminder of another failure. Nora Whitfield stood near the stone fireplace, her chapped hands unsteady as she drew the heavy pan away from the embers. One of the loaves had split open, its crust charred black. The other was misshapen, slumped like her own posture after years hunched over laundry. She let out a quiet sigh of frustration and picked up the knife. From behind her, the scrape of boots on the floorboards announced Clayton. Again, he grumbled, his sniff full of contempt. "Why is it you can't make a simple loaf of bread like a normal woman?" She offered no reply. She hadn't truly answered him in years. He stomped across the room to a chest at the bed's foot, pulling out his own clothes and stuffing them into a canvas sack. "Town meeting tonight. You and the boy stay put. You're an embarrassment." He stopped and his eyes raked over her, judging her like spoiled goods. "You look like someone's tired old mother." "I am his mother," she murmured, but the words were weightless, lost in the stifling air. Her first husband had been gone for years, and the child he'd left her with was a constant source of Clayton's resentment. The boy, Samuel, was her reason for enduring, the one anchor in a life that had otherwise hollowed her out. Clayton suddenly snatched one of her son's small, worn shirts from a hook and tossed it into the fire. No need for that anymore, Nora froze, watching the small garment darken and curl into nothing. No tears came, only the familiar, deep ache in her chest, in the space where hope used to live. As the sun bled rust and violet across the prairie, Clayton mounted his mule and rode off towards the distant lights of town. Nora sat on the porch steps, her apron still dusted with flour, her dark hair, threaded with silver, tied back loosely. The wind whispered through the dry brush, a lonely, ancient song. She watched the last of the light fade before gathering her shawl and heading inside, her son already asleep in his small cot. She did not sleep. Around midnight, the sound of hoofbeats reached the cabin, not one horse, but two. A heavy, potent silence fell after they stopped. The knock that followed was not hurried, just 3 solid thuds that echoed in the quiet room. Clayton swung the door open, lantern held high, and gestured toward her as if presenting property. "There she is. Take them." A figure filled the doorway, a man so broad he seemed part of the shadows. He had powerful arms, a thick beard like dark moss, and a scar that cut across one eyebrow. His attire was practical, wool, leather, and a layer of dust. His name was Boaz, a man of the mountains whom few people ever saw and none truly understood. He remained silent, his gaze steady. Nora rose from her chair, pulling her sleeping son from his cot and holding him close. Samuel stirred, burying his face in her shoulder. "She's got strong hands," Clayton offered, as if selling livestock. "Good for chores. The boy's quiet enough. She can't cook worth a damn, but she doesn't talk much." "You'll appreciate that still." Boaz said nothing. His eyes, dark and watchful as a raven's, rested on Nora's face, then on the child in her arms. His expression was not cruel or leering, but assessing, as if they were a puzzle he was trying to solve. Clayton gave her a rough shove toward the door. "Go on. Earn your keep somewhere else." Nora stumbled forward, her heart a dull, heavy beat in her chest. She didn't cry, not even when her worn shoe caught on the threshold and her foot landed in the cold, hard dirt. Clayton hadn't bothered to tell her to bring proper boots. Boaz turned without a word, leading his own horse down the darkened trail. Nora followed, clutching her son and her shawl, the hem of her dress dragging through the dust and frost. Behind them, the cabin door shut with a final thud. There was no goodbye. They walked for what felt like hours under a pale, bone-white moon. Each step took her further from a life she knew and deeper into a silent, shapeless future. At one point, Boaz stopped and pulled a thick, worn blanket from his saddle bag. He wordlessly draped it around her and Samuel, the wool warm against their skin. She accepted the gesture with a silent nod. The path steepened, winding through dense pines. The sounds of the night woods closed in around them, the call of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf, the soft hush of snowflakes beginning to fall. She tripped on an unseen root, and he steadied her with a firm hand on her elbow, releasing her as soon as she was stable. By the time they reached his cabin, a solid structure of thick logs perched near a cliffside, her legs were trembling with exhaustion. Boaz tied up his horse, then pushed the door open and stood aside, letting her enter first. The inside smelled of pine, wood smoke, and cold stone. It was a space of pure utility, a single large bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a fire already glowing in the hearth. There were no decorations, no feminine touches. She stood by the fire, holding her sleeping son, uncertain of what to do. Boaz brought in her meager sack of belongings and set it by the wall. He moved with the unhurried, deliberate grace of the forest itself. He filled a kettle with water and hung it over the flames. "You hungry?" he finally asked. His voice was deep, weathered by wind and long silences, but it held no malice. She nodded. He handed her a strip of jerky and a piece for Samuel when he woke, then sat on the other side of the room, using a small knife to carve a piece of wood. They existed in that silence as snow began to tap against the roof. Later, he gestured to the bed. "Take it. The boy and you. I'll sleep by the door." She hesitated, but he didn't press the issue. He simply laid out a large buffalo hide near the hearth and settled onto it, a boulder at rest. Nora gently laid Samuel down on the soft bed before curling up beside him. Staring at the dark ceiling beams, she whispered a single, desperate prayer. Please let this be the end of being unwanted star. Morning revealed a world blanketed in white. She awoke to the smell of a fresh fire and the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. Through the window, she saw Boaz outside, his broad back to the cabin, his breath misting in the cold air. She turned away quickly, a flush rising in her cheeks. When he came back inside, he left a pair of sturdy, clean boots near the door, small enough for her. Not a word was exchanged, but it was the first gift she had received in years that came without a price. That evening, she prepared a simple meal of broth and potatoes. He ate every bite without a word of judgment. Waiting for the inevitable criticism that never came, she finally said, "I'm sorry. I don't talk much." He looked up from his plate, his gaze direct. "Don't need talk to understand a person." Her throat tightened. That night, as she stitched a tear in her dress, he sat by the fire, his hands busy with his carving. A small, wooden bear began to emerge from the block of pine. "That's for the boy," he said, not a question. He paused, then added, "It's good to remember that things can still be made." That sentence settled in her heart and stayed there. Just before she drifted off to sleep, she heard him shift on the floor, moving closer to the fire, closer to the bed where she and her son lay. The wind howled, but inside the cabin, it was warm. For the first time in a very long time, Nora didn't dream of escaping. She dreamed of putting down roots. She dreamed of becoming something whole again, not just endured, but seen. As the snow whispered against the window panes, she realized with a start that she and her child had been placed in the hands of a man who, though silent, had never once looked at them with pity, only with a deep, quiet reverence she didn't yet understand. It was more than Clayton had ever offered, and it would be enough to begin again. The morning was hushed and white. Snow lay over the trees like soft blankets, muffling the world in stillness. Inside the cabin, Nora moved with a newfound quietness, her new boots warm and solid on the pine floor. Boaz had gone before the sun touched the frosted windows, the door opening and closing with a whisper of cold air. He never said where he was going, but she had learned he always returned. She stirred a pot of beans over the hearth, the simple, savory scent filling the small space. She was beginning to love the smell of this cabin, not of bitterness or boiled over sorrow, but of wood smoke, leather, and the steady labor of a man who asked for nothing. On the table, the small wooden bear he had carved sat polished and smooth. Her son, Samuel, held it tightly in his hand as he drew pictures with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wood. She picked up a rag and began to wipe down the floor, not because she was told to, but because she needed to. She was making this small corner of the world hers, offering her hands a purpose beyond holding on to memories. By noon, Boaz returned, 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder and a dusting of snow on his beard. He smelled of the mountains, of pine and cold, clean air. "You two eat?" he asked. She shook her head. He nodded, laying the game on a cutting board. They moved around each other in the small space like two people learning a dance by feel, never speaking, never touching, but always aware. As he cleaned the meat, she realized he was humming a low, rugged melody she didn't recognize. The sound was more startling than an overt kindness would have been. They ate on opposite sides of the room, their chairs angled toward the hearth. But when she stood to clear the dishes, she saw an extra piece of cornbread on her plate, slightly burnt but still warm. That night, she unpacked the few belongings Clayton had allowed her, a brush, a small blanket for Samuel, and a square of embroidered linen she'd stitched when her son was born. It was faded now, the pale blue thread spelling out the word *Hope Star. Sitting by the fire, she traced the letters, her eyes burning. Boaz glanced over but said nothing about the unshed tears. Instead, he remarked, "Storm's passing. I'll take the sled to check the trapline tomorrow. Might be gone the night." She nodded. "Do you want us to stay out of your way?" He looked directly at her then. "I want you to be warm." That's all. No one had ever said that to her and meant only that. The next day passed with a strange, slow peace. She patched a seam in one of his old wool shirts she'd found in a chest, her stitches tight and even. By evening, he was back, tired but carrying fresh fish and a block of honeycomb he'd traded for. She stared at the honey, glowing like liquid gold. "Sweets are good in winter," he said gruffly. "Keeps the dark out." She thought about his words long after she'd put the honey on the shelf. As days turned into weeks, a rhythm was established, built not on words but on small, unspoken kindnesses. He would leave a carved fox on the table for Samuel, she would tuck wild herbs into the stew. He placed a hand-woven basket by the door for her foraging, she left a mended glove on his coat. Each quiet gesture felt like a sentence in a story they were writing together. One evening, while sweeping, a sharp pain shot through Nora's leg from an old injury, and she fell hard. The broom clattered to the floor. Panic seized her as she braced for a harsh word or a kick of shame. But Boaz was kneeling beside her in an instant, not touching, just watching. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, biting her lip. "You crying?" She was, but not from the pain. "I'm fine," she managed to say. He helped her to a stool, then knelt and began to unlace her boot. "Don't," she started, embarrassed, but he ignored her. His large hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined her swollen ankle. "Needs rest," he stated. "I'll finish," and he did, sweeping the floor with slow, quiet strokes. That night, she cried into her pillow, not for the fall, but for the startling gentleness with which her brokenness had been met. The next morning, a crutch carved from smooth cedar was leaning against her chair. Later that week, they sat outside under a sky the color of faded denim. A deer moved silently at the edge of the woods. "Do you ever think about leaving here?" she asked quietly. Boaz took a long draw from his pipe. "Left too much already." "We were left," she corrected softly, her gaze distant. "I suppose we're always leaving something, even when we stay put." The wind blew a strand of hair across her face. Boaz reached over and gently tucked it behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek, and the warmth of his touch lingered long after he pulled his hand away. The next morning, she woke to the sound of hammering. Outside, Boaz was building something on the porch. A new rocking chair, unfinished but full of promise. She touched the wood reverently. "Are you making this for someone?" He glanced over. "For the quiet." She smiled. "Well, I hope it likes me sitting in it." A rare, small smile touched his own lips. "It will." When she sat in the chair that evening, she found a folded piece of cloth on the seat. It was her embroidered linen, cleaned and pressed. He must have found it. She held the word *Hope* to her chest and closed her eyes. Later, as she cleared the table, Boaz said, "You were a settler's wife once." "Yes." "And now?" She paused. "I'm still figuring that out." He nodded. "Same." That night, as snow fell again, he found her watching it from the window. He came to stand beside her, holding a thick, deep blue shawl. It wasn't new, but it had been cared for. He gently draped it over her shoulders, his hands resting there a moment longer than necessary. "You're not just warm now," he said, his voice low. "You belong warm." Her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth, but words failed her. For the first time, warmth didn't feel borrowed or conditional. It felt given. And that changed everything. Pine needles started to poke through the melting snow like buried secrets coming to light. The dawn sky was no longer a flat gray but blushed with color. The cabin seemed to settle differently now, its timbers stretching in the slow warmth. Nora stood brushing her salt and pepper hair, her fingers steady. Her reflection in the basin of water was faint, but she saw cheeks that were fuller and eyes that were less haunted. She didn't look younger, but she no longer looked like something that had been thrown away. The red dress hung on a nail by the door. She had sewn it in secret at night, using old fabric Boaz had kept in a chest. It wasn't perfect, but wearing it made her feel like a person with shape and substance, not just a collection of faded memories. That morning, she put it on. When Boaz came in from splitting logs, he stopped short. He didn't say anything, just gave a slow, deep nod before turning back to his work. But Nora saw it, and she smiled to herself. Later, as they ate at the table, now sitting on the same side, he finally spoke. "That color suits you." "I wasn't sure it was proper," she admitted. He took a bite of bread. "Looks like truth." She wasn't sure what he meant, but the words made her sit up a little straighter. The world outside their clearing, however, had a longer memory. Word had trickled down to town that the mountain hermit, Boaz, had taken in Clayton Whitfield's widow and her son. The story was whispered over fences and in the general store, traveling fastest because it was laced with shame. Nora felt the sting of it when she walked into town for salt and thread. Women turned their backs. One muttered, loud enough to be heard, "Some people just don't know when to disappear," and Nora kept her head high, finished her errand, and walked out, catching her own reflection in the dusty window pane. For the first time, she didn't look away. When she returned, she found Boaz mending the roof of the small chicken coop. "They called me a ghost," she said, standing beside him in the twilight. He kept hammering, his rhythm steady. "That so?" She nodded. He wiped his brow and glanced at her. "You don't look like one." "What do I look like?" He paused, considering. "Someone who came back." That night, she made cornbread with molasses, and he ate every piece. As they sat by the fire, her hands busy with a new shawl for Samuel and his with a carving knife, she watched him work. He was whittling 2 foxes, one sitting and one on the move. When he set them on the windowsill, she asked, "Are they together?" He looked up. "They don't need to be, to belong." The next day brought an unexpected storm, with wind and sleet sharp as needles. While rushing to secure the shutters, Boaz slipped on a wet rock, his shoulder hitting the cabin wall with a sickening thud. Nora ran to his side. "I'm fine," he grunted, but she could see the pain in his eyes. She helped him up, her grip surprisingly strong on his arm. Inside, she insisted he remove his shirt so she could inspect the bruising. "You have too much pride," she whispered, pressing a cold cloth to his shoulder. "And you have too much care," he answered, his voice rough. Their faces were inches apart. She didn't move away. "Why did you let us stay?" she asked, the question hanging between them. He met her gaze. "Because you never needed my permission." Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly turned away. The small gestures between them grew more frequent, more intentional. He found her watching him as she stirred a pot. He lingered a moment longer when they passed in the narrow space. He carved her initials, Northwest, into the handle of her favorite wooden spoon. One afternoon, she walked barefoot through the woods, her son running ahead to chase butterflies. Boaz followed, carrying a basket. When she stopped to admire a patch of wild violets, he knelt and picked one. "Used to think these were useless," he admitted. "Too small for anything." "They're not for anything," she said softly. "They're for beauty." He gently tucked the flower into her hair, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed her temple. That evening, as dusk settled like violet smoke, he asked, "You ever dance?" She blinked. Not in years. He stood and offered his hand, its palm rough and scarred. "Can't promise I'm any good at it." She took his hand, and he led her in a slow, swaying circle on the porch, beneath the first stars. There was no music but the whisper of the wind, no rhythm but the beat of two hearts learning to trust each other. When they stopped, she rested her forehead against his broad chest. "I haven't danced since my first husband passed," she confessed. He placed a hand on the back of her head. "Then let this be your next beginning." She slept in the bed that night, while Samuel was curled on his cot. Boaz remained on his pallet by the fire, but the distance between them was no longer measured in feet, but in breaths. The next morning, she found him on the porch, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "Someone from town brought this," he said, his jaw tight. It was a note addressed to her. He handed it over. Her hands shook as she read the familiar, cruel script. Nora. You and the boy still belong to me in the eyes of the law. Don't you forget it. I'll be back to collect what's mine when I please. C*. Boaz crushed the paper in his fist. You don't have to be afraid of him. She looked out at the silent, watching trees. I'm not. He turned and truly looked at her then, at the new strength in her eyes. What are you, then? She met his gaze, and her voice was clear and solid as the mountain they lived on. Ready, and from far down the ridge, carried on the wind, came the faint sound of approaching horses. Boaz was gone, having ridden out at dawn to check his snares. He had promised to be back by dusk, saying the weather looked clear. Now, standing in the cabin, Nora's hands began to shake. A sharp knock echoed from the door. She set down the spoon she was holding, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't move. The knock came again, harder this time. Nora Whitfield, a voice snarled. You in there? She knew that voice, the false charm that barely concealed its cruelty. It was Clayton. No need to be shy, now. Through a crack in the shutters, she saw him, flanked by two rough-looking men she didn't recognize. One held a shotgun loosely in his arms. You think hiding up here with that mountain savage changes the fact that you're my wife? Clayton bellowed. You forgot about the law, woman. You belong to me. Nora reached for the heavy iron poker by the hearth, her son Samuel hiding behind her skirts. The men outside laughed. Look at her, one of them sneered. Still trying to play house. I came to take back what's mine, Clayton yelled. You can come quiet, or you can come sorry. She didn't answer. Instead, she took a steadying breath, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. They blinked in the sudden light. She wore the red dress, her hair braided down her back. Clayton's smirk returned. Well now, don't you look fine? Think a new dress makes you a lady again? I am not your wife, she said, her voice calm and even. He laughed. By what right? By the right of no longer being in your chains. One of the hired men stepped forward. Boss, you want us to grab her and the kid? I'll handle this, Clayton said, stepping onto the porch. You forget, I can have the marshal drag you and that boy back to town by your hair. You could, she whispered, but you'd be dragging back a corpse. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. You touch me or my son again, Clayton Finch, and I swear I will make sure you lose far more than you came for. Just then, a new voice cut through the tension, low and dangerous. Get off my porch. The three men spun around. Boaz stood there, a stillbag over his shoulder, his eyes like gathering storm clouds. Creed, Clayton sneered. You're late. I said, get off, Boaz repeated. The quiet command carried more weight than a shout. The man with the shotgun shifted uneasily. Clayton turned back to Boaz. You have no claim on her. Boaz dropped his bag and took a slow step forward. She's not a thing to be claimed. Then why'd you take her? Boaz's eyes found Nora's. She gave him the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. That was all he needed. Because she and her son deserved to be chosen, he said simply. The air crackled. You gonna fight me over some worn-out widow? Clayton spat. In a blur of motion, Boaz seized Clayton by the collar and slammed him against a porch post. The wood groaned under the impact. Don't you ever, Boaz growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder, call her that again. His fist drew back, then paused. He let Clayton drop to the ground. Walk away now, Boaz said, stepping back, and you get to keep walking. Clayton coughed and scrambled to his feet, glaring at Nora. You'll come crawling back before the year is out. She tilted her head. Then I suppose I'll have to learn how to crawl out of a grave. His men pulled him back down the trail, muttering curses. Boaz didn't watch them go. His gaze was fixed on Nora. She let out a long, shuddering breath. He stepped closer. You all right? No, she said, a tremor in her voice. But I'm standing. He took her hand, and this time, she held on tight. Inside, the fire was burning low. Boaz sat on the floor, leaning against her chair. She rested a hand on his shoulder. I thought you'd be gone longer, she said softly. I rode faster, he answered. After a long silence, she whispered, he'll be back. Boaz nodded. Let him. Later, he placed a small, wrapped bundle on the table. Inside was a leather strip stitched with her initials, Northwest, tied to a small pouch filled with cedar and lavender. What's this for? She asked. For sleep, he said. And for staying. She looked from the pouch to his face. I didn't stay for charity. I know, he said. I stayed, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, because I wanted to be seen. His answer was immediate and sure. You were seen the moment you stepped through my door, and she knew he was telling the truth. But as the wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of a storm, she knew this peace was not yet permanent. A reckoning was still waiting down the mountain. She stood barefoot on the porch as a late spring snow began to fall, lifting her face to the white flakes. The world seemed to slow, the wind whispering her name. Inside, Boaz watched her through the open door, the red of her dress a vibrant slash of color against the snow. She looked lighter, almost reborn. She spun in a slow circle, a small, private dance of joy. Boaz stepped outside, a heavy blanket in his arms. He didn't speak, just watched until she turned to him, her cheeks flushed with cold and life. Have you ever seen snow fall this late in the year? She asked. He shook his head. Not like this. He draped the blanket around her shoulders. Feels like the world is trying to give us a clean start, she mused. They stood together in the quiet snowfall. I don't want to hide anymore, she said after a moment. You don't have to. Inside, the cabin glowed. The fire was warm, the soup was simmering, and the small carved animals on the windowsill stood like silent, tender guardians. Everything felt right. I need to ask you something, Boaz said, his voice unusually hesitant. Nora turned to him. I built this place to be alone, he began, choosing his words with care. Every log was a wall against the world. But you and the boy, you filled it. You turned it back into a home. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, intricately carved ring made of bone, with a tiny pine branch etched along its band. I made this a while ago, he said gruffly. Didn't know if I'd ever have the right to give it to you. Nora Whitfield, will you be my wife? Not taken, not borrowed. Mine, if you'll have me. She looked at him, her lips parted in wonder. And in a voice that was steady and sure, she answered, yes. Not because I need to be saved, but because I see you. And I think, finally, you see me, too. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. But peace is a fragile thing. At dawn, the sound of hoofbeats returned. It was Clayton, but this time he had a deputy and a circuit judge with him. I warned you, Clayton sneered, dismounting. The law is on my side. The deputy unrolled a warrant. your husband has filed for your retrieval. He claims you've been kept here against your will." Before Boaz could speak, Nora stepped forward, barefoot in the fresh snow. She wore the red dress like armor. "I was not taken," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "I walked away." The judge, a man with weary eyes, spoke up. "That's a serious claim against your husband." "He threw us away like garbage," she said, her gaze unwavering. "He tore my clothes, burned my son's things, and called me useless for 20 years. I lived in a house where I was invisible. Now you look at me. Look at my son, safe and warm in that cabin. Do we look caged?" She turned to the deputy. "If you force us to go back, you're signing a paper that says a woman's suffering and a child's safety have no value." "This is highly irregular," the judge muttered. "I came here willingly," Nora declared. "I stay willingly. And I will fight with everything I have before I return to a man who considers me and my child nothing more than property." Boaz moved to stand beside her, a silent, unshakable mountain of support. The judge looked from Nora's defiant face to Clayton's twisted sneer, then to Boaz's quiet strength. "I see no evidence of coercion," the judge said finally. "The law isn't deaf, Mr. Finch. I've heard the lady. Unless you plan to drag her back in chains, she isn't leaving." Clayton's face contorted with rage. "I made you," he hissed at Nora. "No," she said softly, a small smile touching her lips. "You buried me. This man, this life, this is what let me grow." Defeated, Clayton and his men rode away, swallowed by the forest. As their hoofbeats faded, the snow began to slow. Boaz took her hand. "Are you all right?" She smiled, tears of relief tracing paths down her cheeks. "I am whole." That evening, they stood before the fire, their hands clasped. There was no preacher, just two souls finally finding their harbor. "With you," Boaz said, his voice thick with emotion, "I remember who I was before the world taught me to be silent." "And with you," Nora replied, "I learned I was never broken, just waiting for gentle hands." They kissed then, a slow, reverent seal on a promise made long ago in unspoken gestures. Later, she sat in the rocking chair, her son asleep in her lap. Boaz sat nearby, carving a new figure, a woman in a red dress, her head held high. He placed it on the windowsill next to the foxes and the bear. Outside, the trees stood tall, their branches heavy with the last snow of the season. Inside, love had taken root, quiet, strong, and undeniable. And in the warm stillness of the cabin, Nora heard a voice, not from without, but from within. "You are not forgotten. You are not too old. You are seen." The cabin no longer felt like a refuge from the world, it felt like the center of it.